In a restaurant where appearances ruled and silence was survival, one poised black waitress carried more than plates. She carried a gift the world had long ignored. That night, a wealthy man thought he could control the room, and her. But what began as a cruel game became something far more powerful. Beneath the candlelight and clinking glasses, a quiet rebellion was brewing. One not of words, but of music. And when she finally touched the keys, everything changed. Camille adjusted the silverware a third time. No one had asked, but perfection helped her breathe. The polished knives and forks glinted beneath the soft glow of candlelight, each placement precise, symmetrical. She smoothed the linen napkin beside the salad plate with 2 fingers, her movements practiced and nearly invisible to the diners still trickling into the royal oak room. Behind her, a garland-wrapped arch twinkled with tiny lights, framing the entrance like a stage awaiting its performance. She glanced once toward the far end of the dining room. The baby grand piano sat under a canopy of warm golden bulbs, its black, lacquered surface catching every shimmer from the chandelier above. It hadn't been played in weeks. Most guests treated it like elegant furniture, something to admire, but not touch. Yet Camille often felt its presence like a second heartbeat in the room. Silent, patient, watching. Tonight, Savannah carried the faint bite of early December air. The maître d' had remarked on it when she arrived. "Might be our first real chill of the season," he said, tugging his lapel into place. Inside, however, the atmosphere remained heated, not by temperature, but tension. Fridays brought in old money, visiting executives, and society darlings with fur stoles and thin tolerance. The royal oak room sparkled for them, but not without a cost. Camille moved between tables and practiced rhythm, checking crystal, adjusting centerpieces, gently redirecting a junior server whose hands were trembling with a tray of water glasses. "Balance it against your hip," she whispered, steadying the tray with her own palm for a moment. "Like this." The girl nodded, grateful. Camille gave her a small smile before moving on. Table 9 had already filled. A woman in a champagne dress gave Camille a cursory glance before speaking to her husband about weekend plans in Hilton Head. At table 6, 2 men in navy suits exchanged tight laughs over something on a phone screen, glancing once at Camille as if confirming she'd seen nothing. She had. She always did. But she didn't show it. Not in her face, not in her voice. There was safety and restraint. Near the corner, Mr. Elmer Davis sat alone, as he always did on Fridays. His back was straight, posture unbending despite the years. Camille approached with a familiarity neither of them acknowledged aloud. "Your usual?" she asked softly. Elmer's eyes met hers, steady and quiet. "Yes, please, and Jasmine tonight." She nodded, already writing it down. As she turned to go, she heard it, soft, steady, the tap of his index finger against the porcelain saucer. A rhythm, 4 counts, pause, 4 counts again. She didn't have to guess the time signature. In the kitchen, the noise rose, banging pans, orders shouted, the undercurrent of minor chaos. Camille blocked it out. She brewed the tea herself, folding the paper tab gently over the lip of the cup so it wouldn't float. When she returned, Elmer accepted it with a slight incline of his head. "That piano," he said without looking at it, "misses company." Camille didn't answer. She couldn't. The maitre d' approached moments later, eyes tight behind his smile. "Victor Langston just phoned. He's 5 minutes out." Her fingers curled slightly around her notepad. "Warn the staff," he added. "And be ready. You know how he is." Yes. She knew. Back in the dining room, Camille's path took her near the piano. The instrument's curve gleamed like oil on water. She slowed as she passed. Her fingers twitched by instinct, rising just enough to hover above the edge of the closed lid. Cool air grazed her knuckles. She held there, for a breath, maybe 2, then dropped her hand and moved on. The bell above the entryway chimed. A gust of conversation, then laughter spilled into the space like champagne from an overfilled glass. "Well," came a voice loud and polished, "let's liven this place up." Victor ordered the most expensive scotch before sitting. He liked to own a room before entering it. His voice rose over the murmur of clinking glasses and low conversation, and several heads turned toward the entrance, as if drawn by gravity. A maitre d' practically floated in front of him, offering practiced pleasantries that Victor ignored, his eyes scanning the room like a man choosing which string to pluck first. Camille stood near the bar, tray balanced against her side, watching as the man approached his usual corner table near the piano. The instrument loomed there like a silent witness, catching the glint of firelight from the ornate sconces. Behind her, a server whispered too loud in the kitchen doorway. Last time, he made a server sing, just to prove he could. Victor sat with a flourish, his coat draped perfectly over the back of his chair by one of the men in his entourage. Two women followed, both elegant and whisper-thin, their laughter stitched with practiced charm. His companions filled the remaining seats, each of them mirroring his posture, straight-backed, casual in appearance, but unmistakably poised for performance. Victor swirled his drink once, took a sip, and nodded as if the room had passed inspection. Camille approached with a notepad in one hand, her face calm. "Good evening. Would you like to begin with any starters?" Victor smiled, head tilting slightly, as though trying to place her from a dream or a memory he hadn't lived. "Camille, is it?" He glanced at her name tag. "Lovely name, has music in it." She nodded politely. "Thank you. Shall I bring the amuse-bouche, or wait for your guests to settle in?" He waved his hand airily. "Let's keep things moving. But first." His gaze drifted toward the piano. "You ever play that thing?" Camille's grip on her notepad remained firm. "No, sir. I'm just here to serve." "But you do play, don't you?" he asked, tone smooth as his scotch. "Something in your hands, long fingers, steady, not just for carrying plates." A soft laugh from the table. One of the women leaned in, curious. Camille gave a brief smile, non-committal. "It's been a long time." Victor leaned forward. "All the better. Let's see what memory can do." Camille kept her posture level. "I'm afraid that's not part of my duties, sir." "Duties," he repeated, rolling the word over like a coin. Such a dull word. "We all need a little surprise now and then. Don't you agree?" The man beside him chuckled and raised his glass. "Two surprises." Camille shifted her weight slightly. Around them, a few heads turned. Not overtly, but enough to signal interest. One couple paused mid-conversation. The music from the sound system softened, as if it too waited. Victor leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on her. "Let's see it, Camille. Just a little something. No need for Carnegie Hall." He gestured with his glass toward the piano. "Indulge us." Camille looked past him to the maitre d', but the man was speaking to another guest. No rescue coming. No interruption. She could feel her jaw tighten. Elmer Davis, 2 tables over, had lowered his newspaper. He didn't speak, but his gaze met hers, calm, unmoving. "I really can't," she said. "There's service still pending at 6 tables." Victor stood with a theatrical slowness. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his glass to the air, "may I present our very own hidden virtuoso." He swept his arm toward the piano, mock grandiose. "A performance, long overdue." The room reacted not with applause but with silence, a stillness that stretched thin. Camille's breath stuck somewhere between her ribs and throat. Her hands remained steady, but only because she'd trained them to be. Her chest, however, betrayed her, each breath shorter than the last. "I just serve food," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Victor took a step closer, still smiling. "And tonight, perhaps something more." His entourage laughed, her hands clenched. The room didn't ask her to play, but it waited to see if she'd break. Glasses had stopped clinking. Utensils rested idle beside untouched plates. Even the low hum of jazz piped through the speakers had vanished, cut off mid-note as if the sound itself had been startled into silence. All that remained was the soft, tight stillness that comes just before a decision is made. Camille stood in the center of it all, her apron cinched too tightly around her waist, her hands hovering just above stillness. Her breath sat shallow in her chest. The piano near the corner seemed to have crept closer somehow, no longer a background piece of decor, but something looming, alive. She didn't need to look at Victor to know he was still smirking. "When you're being tested," her mother used to say, voice calm as she set a hand on Camille's small shoulder, "don't argue, let your gift speak." That voice now pressed gently into her spine, grounding her as the weight of every eye in the room settled onto her skin. A guest coughed lightly. Another adjusted a napkin just to make sound. The maitre d' kept his face turned politely toward another table, jaw rigid, pretending not to see. Camille scanned the room for a way out, an interruption, a distraction, even a spill, but nothing offered salvation. Elmer Davis, still seated 2 tables away, had folded his hands and placed them carefully on the linen before him. He didn't nod, didn't speak, but his gaze held no judgment, only waiting. She swallowed. Then she walked. Each step toward the piano echoed softly against the hardwood, despite the carpet runners lining the floor. She didn't rush. She didn't smile. She simply moved, her black shoes making almost no sound. To the diners, it might have looked like compliance. To herself, it felt like defiance. Every step both surrender and resistance, every inch a silent declaration that if she was going to be on display, it would be on her terms. The piano's keys were colder than she remembered. She let her fingers rest lightly on them without pressing down, just feeling their texture, their old familiarity. Her chest rose once, deliberately. She sat, adjusted the bench slightly, and placed her hands in position like someone greeting an old friend they hadn't seen in years. There was no warm-up, no deep breath. She just began. The melody started hesitantly, a fragile thread spun into the thick quiet. The notes creaked like a door, opening into a forgotten room, tentative and worn. For a heartbeat, they seemed too soft to matter. A fork shifted. A whisper flared and died. But then, something changed. Her shoulders loosened. Her fingers curved deeper into the ivory. The music spilled into the room, deeper, fuller, unspooling in long, aching lines. Each chord landed not like an announcement, but like a confession, slow and private, meant only for those willing to listen closely. It wasn't a polished piece. It wasn't meant to impress. It was a memory translated into sound, each note coaxed from some buried corner of her ribs. Camille didn't look up, didn't need to. She felt the stillness gathering around her, the humbling quiet that meant the room had stopped resisting and started absorbing. Her hands moved with a quiet urgency, chasing something she couldn't name but knew had always been there. Her face remained calm, but her chest swelled with something between relief and release. Victor sat motionless, his smirk curdling into something harder to maintain. The game he'd started was no longer his to control. At table 6, Elmer Davis mouthed the name of the piece, barely audible, his lips forming the syllables as his eyes welled. The napkin in his lap crumpled in one hand, forgotten. Camille didn't see. Her eyes were closed, her sound unstoppable. The first note barely rose above a whisper, but it was enough to hush the room. A single breath of sound, barely there, and yet everything else seemed to vanish. No clatter of silverware, no shifting of chairs, no idle murmurs. Just that note, trembling, uncertain, but undeniably present. Camille's hands lingered above the keys a moment longer, then moved again, coaxing the melody forward with hesitant grace. Solace in G minor. She hadn't played it in years. The notes felt unfamiliar at first, like pages from a letter she once wrote but never sent. But with each phrase they settled into her fingers, reclaiming old muscle memory and the emotion buried within it. Victor Langston leaned forward in his chair, elbows on the table, scotch untouched. His eyes were locked on Camille, though the grin that usually accompanied his gaze had slipped somewhere between his glass and the growing silence. Camille didn't notice, or if she did, she gave no sign. The room around her began to shift, not in noise or motion, but in energy. An elderly woman at table 6 blinked slowly and reached for a tissue from her purse. Her hand trembled. A couple in the far corner stopped mid-conversation, their food untouched, their eyes softening. In the back near the kitchen, a line cook nudged open the swinging door and froze in place, mouth parted, apron flecked with flour. Elmer Davis sat stiller than anyone, eyes closed, his lips moving with each phrase. He wasn't following the music, he was remembering it, as if hearing it again brought back something he thought he'd lost, a time, a voice, a person. Camille's shoulders relaxed with the rhythm. The ache in the music matched the quiet places inside her, the griefs she had carried silently, the hopes she had folded down small to make space for the practicalities of life. Now, with every bar, they emerged, not like confessions, but like truths too long left unsaid. She didn't look at the crowd. Her gaze stayed inward. Her fingers moved not to perform, but to release, each chord drawn not from memory, but from someplace deeper, beneath language, beneath fear. The music filled the space not with grandeur, but with grace, low, aching tones that felt like forgiveness, like knowing sorrow and refusing to run from it. Victor shifted in his seat. His companions were quiet now. One of the women lowered her gaze, her earlier smirk erased. The young man beside her watched with something like awe, his fork still held aloft, forgotten mid-bite. Camille played on. When she reached the bridge, her hands hesitated, then surged forward, the melody growing fuller, rounder, filled with a quiet force that seemed to tremble the air itself. Her wrists moved like water, the notes wrapping around the room, binding it in stillness. Victor's knuckles were white against his glass. He lifted it, finally, but didn't drink. His expression was unreadable, as though unsure whether to feel outmaneuvered, exposed, or simply forgotten. The final passage drew close. Camille slowed. The tempo dropped into near silence. The melody curled into itself, softer, gentler, until at last she struck the final chord, a single, deep note that hovered like fog in the firelight. Then nothing. No applause. No cough. No scrape of chair legs. Just that hanging silence, so full it seemed physical. Camille's hands rested on the keys, her head slightly bowed, the music still lingering somewhere in the air like a scent that refused to fade. And then Elmer stood. His movements were deliberate, reverent. He brought his hands together once, slowly. The sound cracked like thunder in the stillness. Again. Again. Across the room, another diner rose. Then another. The room followed in ripples, chairs shifting back, backs straightening, palms joining. Camille didn't look up. Her eyes were still closed, her breathing steady, her sound unstoppable. Victor clapped too, slowly, like it pained him. The sound came after everyone else's had risen and begun to fade, like an afterthought, trying to be a headline. 3 deliberate strikes of palm against palm, hollow and late, echoed in the dining room's newly reverent quiet. Then, nothing. The guests began to settle again, murmurs returning like the tide. Waiters resumed their movements, quieter than before, weaving between tables with new grace. The room hadn't returned to normal, something in its air had changed, but it moved forward, as if acknowledging that it couldn't stay suspended forever. Victor rose from his chair. He brushed imaginary dust from his sleeve and adjusted his cufflinks, every motion practiced. But tonight there was something stiff about it. He lifted his glass at last and took a sip. Then, looking toward Camille with a smile that no longer quite fit his face, he said, "Unexpected, but well done, for a waitress." Camille turned toward him slowly. Her face remained composed, her voice even. "I just played," she said. "You chose to make it more." There was no bite to her tone, no rise in pitch. Only truth, laid bare and polished like glass. Her words didn't sting, they unwrapped. Victor looked at her a moment longer, lips parted slightly as if he had something clever ready but couldn't remember the shape of it. Behind him, his entourage sat stiffly. No one laughed. The 2 women glanced down at their menus, though the courses had long finished. The young man beside them looked between Camille and Victor. Then, in a moment of quiet courage, spoke. "You silenced him," he said, almost in a whisper. "Better than any argument could." Victor shot him a look, but the younger man didn't shrink. He leaned back and folded his arms. Camille offered nothing in return. No smile, no nod. She turned away, collecting a tray from a nearby service station, her posture precise, as if the weight of the entire room hadn't just shifted around her. As she passed by table 6, Elmer Davis stood and stepped forward, slow but certain. "That was how my wife used to play," he said softly, stopping just beside her. "Before her stroke, she had hands like yours, steady, full of stories." His eyes glistened, but his voice did not tremble. "You gave her back to me, for a few minutes tonight. That's no small thing." Camille looked at him, her expression breaking slightly, not into a smile, but into something warmer, something real. She touched her hand lightly to her chest, a silent thank you. Elmer nodded and returned to his table, his pace patient, his back a little straighter. Victor lingered at his own. A waiter brought the check. He scribbled his name with a flourish more forceful than elegant. The tip was generous, too generous, but the signature came with a tremble he hadn't intended. Camille took the folder with a quiet, "Thank you," her fingers steady as ever. He waited a moment longer, as if someone might stop him, offer him a lifeline, redirect the moment. No one did. He turned toward the door and walked, not slowly, not quickly, but but deliberately. And just before the door closed behind him, he looked back. No one was watching. In her quiet apartment, Camille played not for applause, but for herself. The piano wasn't grand or polished like the one in the dining room. Its keys were uneven in color, the wood dulled with age, a hairline crack snaking along the side of the fallboard. But the sound it made, soft, worn, honest, belonged only to her. It filled the space without asking permission, without dressing itself for company. The room around her was dim, lit by a single lamp casting a golden pool onto the floor and catching the edge of a chipped photo frame on the bookshelf. Outside, Savannah had gone still. A faint rustle of wind pressed against the windows, but inside there was nothing but warmth. Quiet warmth. The kind that didn't beg to be noticed. Camille sat in her faded robe, hair unpinned, a cup of half-drunk tea cooling by the windowsill. Her shoes lay abandoned by the door. She had not turned on the television, had not picked up her phone. Instead, she had emptied her pockets of folded bills and spare change, counting the night's tips by habit before finding the small note tucked between two tens. It was handwritten, in a script that was careful but confident. "My niece runs a studio, she'd want to hear you. No pressure, just promise me one thing. Keep playing. Elmer Davis." Her fingers lingered on the page. She set it down gently beside the metronome she rarely used, then turned back to the piano. The bench creaked as she shifted. No one would hear this. No one would interrupt it. And still the act felt sacred. She let her hands rest over the keys. No plan, no sheet music, no familiar routine. Then, slowly, she began. It was a melody she didn't know yet, one that arrived without name or form. The notes wove themselves forward, unsure but unafraid. There were pauses, detours, small flourishes that made no sense, and yet felt perfectly placed. It was nothing she could repeat. It lived only here. She closed her eyes. This time, the song was her own. The room held it tenderly, as if careful not to disturb. A breeze lifted the curtain by the fire escape, just enough for moonlight to fall across the keyboard. It touched her hands in thin silver bands, caught the edge of a bracelet on her wrist, her mother's. The tiny clasp glinted faintly, a reminder not of what she'd lost, but of what she'd carried all this time. She didn't need an audience, but maybe, for the first time, she was ready for one. Moonlight brushed her fingers as the final note faded, not into silence, but into something softer. Acceptance. Camille no longer needed to be noticed to feel whole. What once felt like invisibility now felt like freedom. Sometimes, the quietest rebellions speak the loudest. When dignity holds its ground, arrogance collapses under its own weight. Power built on spectacle never lasts, but truth, whispered in the right key, can still a room. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone who needs reminding. You don't have to raise your voice to be heard.